Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Thursday, April 10th. Well, it's been a few months since we've taken a look at the global sea ice situation. The last time we focused in on both the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere was at the very beginning of the winter in early December. Certainly there has been a lot of cold and snowy weather in the North American continent during the interim time period throughout the winter of 2013-2014. One of the areas where the cold weather really was concentrated on was the Great Lakes region of the northern U.S., southern part of Canada. The ice aerial extent on the Great Lakes reached record highs on many dates throughout the winter season, and the very latest reading shows still some incredible ice coverage on the Great Lakes. In fact, here we are in the early to mid part of April now. This is the latest ice aerial extent, more than 50% coverage of ice on the Great Lakes. This data presented by the Canadian Ice Service. This is still way above any of these years, going all the way back to the early 1980s. This particular plot started in 1980, 1981, and again, this is for this current week here of April 9th. The ice aerial extent on the Great Lakes continues at more than 50% coverage, way above anything seen going all the way back to the early 1980s. Of course, this represents only a very small portion of the northern hemisphere sea ice aerial extent. Let's now focus in on that particular part of the globe. Well, before we focus in on the northern hemisphere sea ice anomaly, wanted to point out the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, which is an index tracked by meteorologists that tends to correlate well with the sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic. I wanted to focus in on the mid-1990s, right in this time frame right here. This is the mid-1990s time frame here. Notice this AMO index, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation Index, actually flips signs here from the negative represented by the blues here to a positive phase. The negative represents colder than normal sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic, and the positive phase, warmer than normal sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic. We have been in basically a warm phase of the AMO since the mid-1990s. Again, just wanted to focus in right now on that time frame of the flip of the AMO in the mid-1990s, because it seems to be directly correlated quite well with what's going on right now in the northern hemisphere in terms of sea ice anomalies. Well, here is in fact the latest northern hemisphere sea ice anomaly chart. All of this data from the University of Illinois Cryosphere website. They get their data from the Snow and Ice Data Center of NOAA, and presented in nice plots like this, for example. And notice here the trend line change in the mid-1990s. Here the mid-1990s, right in this region right here. And notice that the trend lines tended to change at this particular time. Basically a sideways trend with above normal sea ice anomaly in the northern hemisphere. And then the AMO flipped from a negative to a positive right in this time frame right here. And since then, there's been basically a downward trend for many, many years following that AMO flip. Now, the last few years there's been kind of a leveling off. So certainly some different trend lines here. Still below normal in the northern hemisphere, 0.566 below normal for this particular time of the year in terms of overall sea ice aerial extent in the northern hemisphere. But a significant change occurred in the mid-1990s, and I believe that when the AMO flips back to a negative phase, perhaps in just the next few years or even sooner than that, the northern hemisphere sea ice will get back to a normal or even above normal levels, much as it was in the pre-mid-1990s. Well, here's another way to look at the northern hemisphere sea ice aerial extent from the University of Illinois Cryosphere website. This is actually a running total throughout the days of the year, beginning early in January, of course, right in this region right here. We are now in this time frame right here. The yellow line represents where we stand in terms of northern hemisphere sea ice aerial extent for this particular time, and this is the April 9th time period right here. And notice here it's below most of the years. All these other lines represent individual years going all the way back to the beginning of the satellite data record-keeping time frame in the late 1970s. This data actually goes back to 1979, so certainly above a few recent years, but still on the lower end of the middle of the pack here in terms of comparison to years going back to the late 1970s. But again, I believe it's directly correlated with the AMO, and once that AMO flips to a negative phase, this is very likely to climb back to normal, to even above normal levels, surpassing many of those years. So we'll keep an eye on that over the next several months and years to come. Well, in terms of the southern hemisphere, quite a different picture. The northern hemisphere is still below normal, but the southern hemisphere is not only above normal, but it's at or near record high level content for sea ice aerial extent, again, in the southern hemisphere. And it's been undergoing quite a dramatic rise over the last few years. This is the trend line since about 2010, 2011 time frame has virtually been straight up in this fashion here to way above normal levels. Only seen this high a few times over the last many years. This particular plot also goes back to 1979, the beginning of the satellite data keeping era. So again, very high levels, near record or record highs on this particular date in the southern hemisphere. Only seen a few times over the past several decades. Compared to normal, it's way above for this particular time of the year. Well, here's a similar plot that we just saw a while ago for the northern hemisphere. This is the southern hemisphere and where it stands relative to all those individual years going back to the late 1970s. Here is that yellow line right here that represents 2014, and it's at almost at a record high for the date. Again, this particular time is the time frame we're in right now, April 9th, 10th time period. Again, above almost every single year going back to the late 1970s. This continues quite an impressive run in the southern hemisphere, way above normal in terms of sea ice aerial extent. Well, how does all this translate to the global summary right now in terms of sea ice aerial extent and how it relates to normal? Well, this too is from the University of Illinois Cryosphere website and is the very latest global sea ice anomaly. This is the normal line. This black line right here represents normal, and here's where we stand right now, above normal on a global basis, thanks in large part to what's been going on in the southern hemisphere. Again, northern hemisphere is somewhat below normal, the southern hemisphere way above normal in terms of sea ice aerial extent. On a global basis, we are above normal, and notice in the last several weeks there's been kind of a spike up right in this time frame right here. It's actually spiked up over the last several weeks to significantly above normal for this time of the year. So we'll continue to monitor this over the weeks and months to come, as it's quite interesting to follow what goes on in both the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere and how that translates to the global sea ice aerial extent. That's it for now. For the SIWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.